I never hear about public shootings happening in New York City. Why is that? NYC records between 400,000 and 500 murders a year. They just happen mostly to drug dealers and other dregs of society. So it gets no attention. American media is mostly numb to gun violence. It takes a rampage in a place with innocents, like the one in Maine yesterday, to make the news. And I think the number of victims was 18. But there were really 20,958 murders involving a firearm in 2021. That doesn't include injuries or suicide numbers involving a firearm. Many of those more than 20,000 were public shootings. For example, gang-related. But because the murder count wasn't high enough or the victims innocent enough, it never makes the news. Spider-Man. I think mass shootings are pretty common in urban areas and often involve poor people, minorities, gangs, and whoever else the media doesn't care about. It'll make the local news. But on a nation level, people don't care about crimes happening in those contexts because they're kind of expected. Unfortunately, New York is much safer compared to most big American cities. NYC is safer than you'd think. Plus, there are gun laws restricting ownership and carrying. Then there's the sheer number of people living there that would make it hard for anyone to get away. With a mass shooting, you'd see it on the local news. 1. With heavily populated cities like NYC, LA, etc., there's security everywhere. New York has to be one of the most heavily policed places in the country for this exact type of thing. 2. Even with all the deterring, there still are shootings that happen there. They're just not drastic enough to make news regularly. The news is, by definition, new stuff. If on average more than one shooting happens per day, they're not gonna get covered. People would stop caring. The only ones that do get coverage are the ones involving large numbers of innocent people. And that's not the shootings in New York. It's like how you never hear about shootings in Oakland unless it happens to people who aren't the typical people involved in shootings. It might be on the local news if a stray bullet hits a kid, but most shootings are between gangs or drug dealers or people who the news equates to gang members or drug dealers. Hi, actual New Yorker here. There's a lot of things that feed into it. 1. Gun ownership laws are pretty strict here, not to say people don't get them, but it's uncommon to see a gun not on a police officer. And the guns people do have are more likely sidearms, not semi-automatic weapons, so they are concealed easier. There are shootings that happen in higher crime areas. Unfortunately, they tend to be low-income areas as well and are treated with the, well, what do you expect? Sentiment. It's a story on the local news and that's it. New York also has a huge police force, and those bad areas often have 2x the police presence. And finally, lots of people's idea of NYC is Manhattan. If a mass shooting happened in Midtown, it would definitely be national news. I mean, last year a guy was stabbing people in Times Square and it was national news. And the Brooklyn subway shooting was national news. Location plays a huge factor. Their laws surrounding gun ownership are significantly more strict than other states. There are shootings all the time. But it mainly happens in the more ghetto areas where it's not really newsworthy. Hard to legally obtain a firearm. And even when you apply, it probably takes anywhere from 512 months. You can't even buy a shotgun without a permit like most other places. Past 2 years it's changed though. Concealed carry used to be virtually impossible to get until the SC overruled this, and it is now pretty easy after a safety course of a few days. Gun ownership in NYC is very strict. Unlike the rest of country. For the most part, the only folks with guns in NYC are cops and criminals. A lifelong New Yorker for 50+ years. If I were to wager a guess, it'd be a few things. 1. High police presence. The police response time in NYC to an active shooter is probably sub 5 minutes. They have trained counter-terrorism units and a budget bigger than many countyres' armies. This already makes it an unattractive option for someone looking to kill as many people as possible. 2. While the population density is high, and there's probably a lot of good places for crowds to shoot into, a lot of those places have too many people and not enough space to gain a decent vantage point. 3. New York City is a tough place. You have to grow a thicker skin to live there. As such, there's probably a higher than average collection of folks willing to play the hero to take you down once you start shooting. I think access to guns could be one of the reasons. In many big US cities, buying a handgun legally is a lengthy process, let alone an assault rifle. It's kinda hard for people to commit mass shootings when they don't have easy access to firearms. You never hear about them in any city. They are pretty randomized so that the odds of them happening in one particular city aren't great. But they're guaranteed to be a few high-profile shootings a year in some city. It's not surprising that you haven't heard about any in New York. But there probably will be one at some point. Because DNA and the larger papers don't want to cover anything that occurs above 96th Street or in the boroughs. The last time the papers covered a death in Harlem, was a Barnard girl who got killed buying drugs. Weekly gang and crime stats are suppressed in the news. Even worse, we FOIA'd the state for the statistics and their answer was sue us. NYC is very safe and random mass shootings, i.e., with specific targets in mind, are generally pretty rare. The primary salience of mass shootings rests on their random nature. Most shootings are between people who know each other. That's obviously scary if you happen to be in the area. But otherwise there's no serious risk for most people. The random shootings are scary to the average Joe because average Joe is not in a gang. Nor does he live near a lot of shootings. Nor does he own a gun. They're a vividly imaginable, though unfathomably small, possibility that average Joe being the target of the mass shooting. It's also worth mentioning that mass shootings are very rare. The usual America jokes aside, the risk of dying in a random mass shooting is vanishingly small. But it's a much scarier death than the comparably likely falling off a ladder, being hit by a tree blown by wind, are comparable random causes of death. 95+% of the gun deaths in this country are suicides or targeted homicides, which are usually much less newsworthy simply because they are so common. None of this is meant as an apologia for guns. Guns kill tens of thousands of Americans a year, and that's extremely messed up. But I often feel that the media emphasis on these AR-15 style dramatic mass shootings overlooks the much more serious issues of targeted homicide and suicide, which are usually committed with handguns or non-assault rifles.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. TooAfraidToAsk is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.